People often say the greatest heroes are the ones who never speak of their battles. They live quietly, unnoticed, until a single act of kindness reveals the depth of their soul. This is not the story of a famous soldier, nor a celebrated leader. It is the story of a school janitor, an old man with a broom in his hand and compassion in his heart. One sandwich, one silent gesture, and an entire battalion of Marines standing at attention. Stay with me, because what happened next will remind you that even the smallest act of love can change lives forever. If you believe in kindness, in sacrifice, in the quiet power of compassion, don't forget to follow, like, and share this story with someone who needs hope. They say kindness is a language that even silence can speak. At Pinewood Elementary, in a small rural town of Arkansas, that language was spoken daily by an old janitor named James Holler. He was 68 with weathered hands and a back slightly bent from years of labor. Yet he moved with quiet purpose. Each morning, long before the first school bell rang, James arrived carrying a modest lunchbox, his gray coveralls neatly pressed, his shoes polished though worn at the soles. The students rarely paid him much attention. To them, he was just the janitor, the man who swept hallways, cleared snow from sidewalks, and fixed lockers when they jammed. But for the teachers, James was more than that. They relied on him, his punctuality, his quiet smile, his unwavering presence. The principal often said that if James wasn't seen in the hall by 6:45 sharp, something must be wrong. He was part of the rhythm of the school, like the ticking of a clock no one noticed until it stopped. Yet James carried a secret routine of his own, something no one had ever asked him about. Each day, after unlocking the maintenance closet and beginning his rounds, he would set aside part of his lunch. Sometimes it was half a sandwich, sometimes fruit, other times a small homemade cookie wrapped carefully in wax paper. At exactly 7:15, he would walk toward the stone bench tucked away in the corner of the east playground. There, without a word, he placed the food in a bottle of water, then turned his back and continued on his way. It seemed an odd ritual until one began to notice the boy. Lucas was 9 years old with solemn eyes and clothes that hung too loose on his frame. His parents had recently divorced, and his life had been reduced to a series of half-packed boxes and unfamiliar classrooms. Unlike other children who rushed in just before the bell, Lucas always arrived early. Sometimes as early as 7, he would sit quietly on the front steps, a dog-eared book balanced on his knees, his shoulders hunched against the morning chill. He rarely spoke, never caused trouble, and when lunchtime came, he would pretend he wasn't hungry. But James had noticed. He noticed the stale crackers Lucas sometimes carried, the way the boy lowered his eyes when other children opened lunchboxes filled with sandwiches, fruit, and juice boxes. He noticed, too, the quiet pride in Lucas's face, the kind that would rather starve than ask for help. So James began leaving food on that stone bench. No words, no questions, no explanations. Just a sandwich, a piece of fruit, a cookie, and water. And every day, Lucas would wait until no one was watching, then slip over, take the meal, and nod ever so slightly in James' direction. One Tuesday morning, the fragile silence of this ritual was broken. A group of fifth graders, loud and restless near the basketball court, spotted the exchange. "Teacher, look! The janitor's feeding that hungry kid again!" One of them shouted, his voice dripping with mockery. Laughter rippled across the playground. Heads turned. Ms. Parker, the fourth-grade teacher on duty, frowned and started toward the group, uncertain what to do. But James did not flinch. He simply smiled, the same gentle smile he wore when mopping spilled milk or patching broken lockers. He nodded politely to Ms. Parker, bent to set down the wrapped sandwich and water bottle, and walked away without a word. His cleaning cart rattled softly as he pushed it toward the gym. The laughter died quickly. Perhaps the students expected anger or embarrassment. Instead, James's quiet dignity left them unsettled. Lucas, who had frozen in place, waited until the crowd dispersed before retrieving the food. He sat with his back to the wall, eating slowly, each bite carrying more weight than anyone around him could imagine. Teachers had noticed, of course. Ms. Parker, and even Principal Winters, knew James was feeding the boy, but they never intervened. They sensed something unspoken between the two, something that was more than pity or charity. It was an arrangement born of recognition, a man who had seen enough of life to recognize hunger, and a child who needed more than just lessons from a book. For 3 months, this silent bond continued. Every morning, James arrived with his lunchbox. Every day, Lucas found a meal waiting for him. And every afternoon, the boy walked home with just a little more strength than he had before. No one else thought much about it. To the world, it was just a janitor leaving scraps for a poor kid. But beneath that small, ordinary act lived something far greater, something that would soon bring an entire school, and even a battalion of Marines, to a standstill. The next morning, the rhythm of Pinewood Elementary unfolded as it always did. Doors unlocked, floors swept, voices of children echoing in the halls. Yet for James, something felt different. He couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was the way Lucas lingered a moment longer near the bench, his small hand gripping the sandwich as though it carried more than bread and meat. Perhaps it was the look in the boy's eyes, hesitant, almost searching. At lunchtime, James had been repairing a stubborn water fountain when he noticed a folded piece of paper slipped under the door of the maintenance room. Curious, he stooped to pick it up. The handwriting was uneven, the letters large and deliberate, pressed hard into the page with a pencil that had seen too many erasures. James opened it carefully. "Thank you for the sandwiches. My dad was a Marine too. I don't know if he's alive anymore, but you remind me of him." The old man sat heavily on his stool, the note trembling in his hands. For years, he had trained himself not to feel too much. Since Vietnam, emotions had been something tucked away, like medals in a box never opened. But this simple message from a child, pierced through the walls he had built. His eyes grew damp, and he rubbed them quickly, ashamed of the weakness even in private. That evening, for the first time in a long while, James didn't simply throw together his lunch absent-mindedly. He prepared with care. From his kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cookies drifted through the small apartment. He laid out slices of turkey on homemade bread, polished a bright red apple until it gleamed, and wrapped everything neatly in wax paper. He placed the package gently into his lunchbox, as if preparing a gift. The next morning, Lucas found the meal waiting on the bench as always. But this time, the difference was clear. The cookies were still warm, the apple shone, and the sandwich was wrapped with a precision that spoke of thought, of effort, of love. The boy's eyes welled up, though he quickly turned his face away from the other children. He ate every crumb. From that day, their silent arrangement shifted subtly. Lucas no longer pretended not to notice James. Instead, he began to raise a hand in a small wave whenever he saw the janitor across the playground. And James, with his quiet dignity, would lift his fingers to his brow in a gesture that was not quite a salute, not quite a tip of the hat. Something in between, something only the two of them understood. Neither spoke, neither explained. Yet between them a bond was forming that words could not capture. Teachers watched from afar, touched but uncertain how deep the connection went. Ms. Parker remarked to Principal Winters one afternoon, "It's more than just food. That boy sits straighter now. He smiles sometimes. Whatever James is doing, it's working." But James didn't see it as anything extraordinary. To him, Lucas was simply a child who should not have to endure hunger, neither of the body nor of the soul. He knew that kind of hunger too well. He had seen it in villages across the ocean, in the eyes of fellow soldiers who lost more than meals. The school carried on, unaware of how significant this small relationship was becoming. While other children laughed and played, Lucas carried within him a secret comfort. Someone noticed him. Someone cared. For a boy who had learned to live quietly on the edges, that knowledge was a lifeline. Then came the morning when Lucas broke the unspoken rules entirely. He did not just wave. He did not just nod. He walked slowly, deliberately, toward the maintenance closet during lunch, his hands fidgeting at his sides. James, fixing a hinge, looked up in surprise. The boy hesitated at the door, then slipped another folded piece of paper beneath it before hurrying away, his small frame disappearing down the hall. Inside, James opened the note with a steadying breath. "I wish my dad was here. But when you leave me food, it feels like he is." James closed his eyes. For years, he had lived in silence, believing the best parts of his life, the camaraderie, the service, the purpose, had ended with the war. Yet here was a boy who saw him, who connected him again to something sacred. In that moment, James understood that what he was giving was more than a meal. He was giving Lucas a fragment of belonging, of fatherhood, of hope. From then on, the bench was no longer just a place for food. It became a symbol, a place where an old Marine, now disguised as a janitor, gave not only bread but pieces of his heart. And a hungry boy received more than nourishment. He received stability, comfort, and the quiet sense that he was not alone. What no one yet knew was how this simple exchange, born of compassion and silence, would soon ripple far beyond the stone bench. For destiny was already moving, quietly aligning two lives with a history neither of them could have imagined. Monday morning began like any other. The air was crisp, the sun casting long shadows across Pinewood Elementary's playground. Children spilled through the gates, chattering and laughing. Teachers gathered clipboards and coffee cups, ready to usher another week of lessons. James Holler moved through the cafeteria, bent over a stubborn stain on the linoleum floor, his rag working in steady circles. It was routine, just another ordinary day. Then the intercom crackled to life. "Mr. Holler, please report to the front entrance." James straightened, puzzled. In 15 years of service to the school, he had rarely been summoned during class hours. He folded the rag carefully, wiped his hands, and began walking down the hall. His boots clicked softly on the polished tile, echoing against the walls. As he drew closer to the main entrance, the atmosphere shifted. Students stood frozen at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass. Teachers whispered, their expressions caught between confusion and awe. The silence felt heavy, expectant. James reached the doorway and stopped in his tracks. Outside, parked in the fire lane, were 4 black SUVs with government plates. Lined up before the school in perfect formation stood 12 Marines in full dress blues, their posture rigid, brass buttons gleaming in the morning sun. Their presence was striking, almost surreal against the backdrop of an elementary school. James's heart clenched, an instinct he hadn't felt in decades. The sight of the formation, the precision of their stance, pulled him back in time. He could smell the dust of faraway roads, hear the roar of engines, feel the pulse of duty in his veins. For a moment, it was as if the war had never ended. The lead officer, a tall man with captain's insignia on his shoulders, spotted James through the glass. He spoke softly to his men, and as one, they adjusted their posture. 12 hands snapped to their brows in perfect salute, directed at him. James froze, his breath caught. Principal Winters appeared at his side that wide-eyed and whispering, "Mr. Holler, do you know what this is about?" Before James could answer, the captain stepped forward, removed his cap, and entered the building. His shoes clicked sharply against the tile as he approached with solemn respect. "Ma'am," he said, addressing the principal with a slight bow of his head, "I am Captain Rodriguez, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. We're here to express our gratitude to the man who has been looking after Sergeant Jackson's son." The words hung in the air like thunder. Teachers gasped. Students looked at one another in stunned silence. Principal Winters turned slowly toward James, realization dawning in her eyes. "That would be Mr. Holler," she whispered. The captain studied James, his eyes flicking over the straight posture, the subtle discipline in his stance, the way his hands instinctively clasped behind his back. "You were a Marine," Rodriguez stated, not asked. James swallowed, his voice low but steady. "Transport Division, 71 to 75. The captain nodded firmly. "Then you understand what it means when Marines make a promise." He drew a breath, his voice carrying across the hushed hallway. "Sergeant Nathan Jackson, father of Lucas Jackson, saved many of our lives in Fallujah. Before his final mission, he made us promise that if anything happened to Naeem, we would find his son and make sure he was cared for. It took us time to locate him, but when we did, we learned someone here had already stepped in." The silence deepened, eyes turned toward James. His mind reeled, his chest tightening. Lucas, the boy with solemn eyes, the boy he had fed for months. Sergeant Jackson's son, every sandwich, every apple, every cookie. They had not just been meals. They had been the fulfillment of a sacred promise, though James had never known it. The captain's voice softened, almost reverent. "We are here today to honor Sergeant Jackson's memory and to thank the Marine who stepped in when we could not. James blinked rapidly, fighting to steady himself. His rag, still clutched in his hand, felt strangely heavy. He had been just a janitor, or so he thought. Yet now, before the eyes of an entire school, he stood as something more. Principal Winters placed a trembling hand on his arm. "Mr. Holler, all this time." But James shook his head. Words seemed too small, too fragile. His mind was filled with the image of Lucas, alone, hungry, proud, yet quietly resilient. The boy's father had given everything for his fellow Marines. And now, through sheer chance, or perhaps something greater, James had been placed in the boy's path. The Marines stood tall, their salute unwavering. Outside, the sun glinted off their polished insignia. Inside, the air buzzed with a reverence no one could quite name. For James, time seemed to blur. The hall dissolved, the voices faded, and all that remained was the echo of an old truth. Marines never leave their own behind. And somehow, without even knowing it, he had been living that creed all along. The gymnasium at Pinewood Elementary had never been so silent. The entire school had been gathered. Students, teachers, staff, all seated on bleachers, their eyes fixed on the line of Marines standing at the entrance. At their side, Principal Winters looked both proud and bewildered, as if she too was struggling to believe what she was witnessing. In the center of it all stood James Holler. His coveralls were still dusted with chalk from cleaning blackboards, his hands rough from years of labor. Yet to the Marines, he was no janitor. He was one of their own. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice strong but heavy with emotion. 40 years ago, Corporal James Holler saved 16 Marines during the evacuation of Saigon. He drove routes considered impossible, returning 3 times under fire to rescue stranded men. The protocols he created for transport units are still taught in the Marine Corps today. Gasps rippled through the crowd. James shifted uncomfortably, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had never spoken of those days, never wanted to relive them. To him, it was simply survival. To them, it was heroism. Rodriguez continued, his gaze moving toward Lucas in the front row. What many don't know is that Sergeant Nathan Jackson, Lucas's father, followed those very same protocols during his final mission. He gave his life shielding civilians in Fallujah, driving into danger so that others might live. Sergeant Jackson died as Corporal Holler once lived, guided by the same creed, never leave anyone behind. The gym was still, the weight of the words sinking deep. 2 Marines separated by decades, connected by rules written in the dust of war. From the back of the room came a sob. Ellen Jackson, Lucas's mother, stood with tears streaming down her face. She had been invited to the assembly without explanation, unaware of the revelation awaiting her. Now, hearing her husband's name linked to the quiet janitor she had passed in hallways, she understood. Nathan's last letter flashed in her mind. "If anything happens to me, take Lucas to Pinewood. There are good people there." She had never understood why, until now. When the captain finished speaking, he motioned for an officer to step forward. In his hands was a shadow box. Inside rested Sergeant Jackson's unit patch, his service medals, and a faded photograph of his squad. On the wall behind them, barely visible, was a poster of transport guidelines. Holler's rules for getting home alive. The officer presented the box to James, his voice solemn. Sergeant Jackson carried this photo always. He said it reminded him of what mattered most. James took the box, his hands trembling. For a long moment he could not speak. The weight of memory, of connection, pressed too heavily on his chest. Then a small voice broke the silence. "You knew my dad." Lucas had risen from his seat, his eyes wide and searching. James lowered himself onto one knee, his joints protesting the movement. He met the boy's gaze, his own lined with years of stories left untold. "Not directly, son," he said gently. "But in the Marines, we're all connected. Your father walked the same path I did. He was brave. The bravest." Lucas swallowed hard. "Mom says he saved people." James nodded. "That's what drivers do. We go where others won't, to make sure no one's left behind." The boy's eyes shone with tears, yet there was pride there too, pride he had never been able to feel before. He stepped forward, wrapping his thin arms around James's shoulders. The embrace was quiet, but in that gym it spoke louder than any applause. Ellen joined her son, her voice thick with emotion. "I should have told you who was helping him," she whispered to James. "I just didn't know. I've been so overwhelmed. James shook his head firmly. No need, ma'am. A Marine's family is everyone's responsibility. That's just how it is. The captain cleared his throat, drawing the school's attention once more. The Marine Corps does not forget its promises. Today we announce the establishment of the Sergeant Nathan Jackson Scholarship Fund, guaranteeing Lucas's education through college. In addition, housing support has been arranged for the Jackson family, a new home, 2 blocks from this school. The gym erupted in gasps and applause. Teachers wiped their eyes. Students clapped without fully understanding why. For them, it was like witnessing a storybook hero come to life. James, however, felt none of the triumph. He bowed his head, humbled, even embarrassed by the attention. He had never acted for recognition. He had acted because he saw a boy who was hungry, because he knew what it meant to be left behind. As the applause swelled, Principal Winters leaned close to him and murmured, "You've been working here for 15 years, and I never knew you were a decorated Marine." James gave a faint smile. "Never saw the need to mention it. The war's long over." Her voice softened. "But what you've done, then and now, deserves to be remembered." James's eyes grew distant, the weight of memory returning. Recognition isn't why we do things, not the important ones anyway. And in that single sentence, spoken simply, he reminded everyone present that heroism is not measured in medals or applause. It is measured in quiet choices made when no one is watching. The Marine stood straighter. The students leaned forward. Ellen held her son's hand tighter, and James Holler, once just a janitor, stood revealed as something much greater, a silent guardian whose kindness had bridged generations, connecting father and son across the gulf of sacrifice. Yet even this revelation was not the end. For what had begun with a single sandwich was about to ripple further, reshaping not only a boy's life, but the spirit of an entire community. The weeks following the Marines' visit transformed Pinewood Elementary into something of a sanctuary. What had begun as whispers about the janitor and the boy grew into a story that spread across town, then beyond. Yet in the midst of the attention, James remained the same, quiet, humble, walking the halls with his broom and his smile. Reporters came, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. But James had little interest in interviews. When asked, "How does it feel to be called a hero?" he only shook his head and replied, "I'm not the hero here. Nathan Jackson is. I just saw a hungry child." Then he walked away, leaving the reporter speechless. The community, however, refused to let his deeds go unnoticed. The Parent-Teacher Association placed a bronze plaque beside the stone bench where James had left countless meals. It read, "Here a man who said nothing made an entire battalion of Marines stand at attention." Teachers began using the story as a lesson in character and citizenship. Sometimes, Ms. Parker told her class, the biggest heroes are the quietest ones. They don't wear capes. They just see needs and fill them. For Lucas, life began to change in ways both small and profound. The withdrawn, solemn child slowly blossomed into a boy who smiled more freely. His grades improved. He joined the science club, raising his hand in class for the first time. Each morning he arrived early, not to sit alone, but to help James with small tasks, holding trash bags, wiping down tables, or simply walking beside him as they shared quiet conversation. The lunches continued, but now they were shared meals, sometimes in silence, sometimes with Lucas peppering James with questions about tools, engines, and the mysteries of machines. "How does a transmission work?" he asked one morning. James drew diagrams in the dust with a stick, his explanations patient and clear. Other students began joining, turning lunchtime into impromptu lessons in mechanics and life. The Marines kept their promise too. Members of Sergeant Jackson's unit took turns visiting Pinewood monthly. They repaired the Jacksons' new home, drove Ellen to job interviews, and ensured Lucas knew his father's sacrifice was not forgotten. On Veterans Day, Captain Rodriguez returned to stand alongside James, convincing him, though reluctant, to accept recognition. A photograph of James and Lucas, both wearing Marine Corps caps, became the face of a regional veteran support campaign. Ellen, too, found healing. She had once locked away all reminders of Nathan, believing it would protect her son. But with James's steady presence, she realized the opposite was true. "You gave him more than food," she told James during a Sunday dinner at his apartment. You gave him back his father without even knowing it. Perhaps the greatest change came in James himself. A man who had once carried his war stories like a hidden burden began sharing them, not as tales of glory, but as lessons. At Principal Winter's request, he developed a basic vehicle maintenance elective for middle schoolers. But woven into every lesson about oil changes or brakes were values he considered essential: thoroughness, responsibility, attentiveness to others. 6 months later, an official letter arrived from the Marine Corps Commandant. Holler's rules, the simple, practical guidelines James had written in wartime, were being incorporated into the official training manual for all transport divisions. His words, born of necessity, would now guide generations. James smiled quietly when he read the letter. They were never really my rules, he told Principal Winters. Just common sense when people's lives depend on you. Check your vehicle. Watch the road ahead. And remember who's riding with you. On the 1-year anniversary of the Marines' visit, Pinewood dedicated a new memorial garden. At its center stood the same stone bench, now framed by flowers and a flagpole flying both the American flag and the Marine Corps standard. The space was named the James Holler Friendship Garden. Principal Winters addressed the crowd, two Marines who never met, bound across time by duty, honor, and kindness. Let this place remind us, heroism often looks like an ordinary person doing what's right when no one is watching. Lucas, taller now and more confident, stood proudly at James's side during the ceremony. The boy no longer sat alone at lunch. He no longer hid behind silence. Instead, he had found strength in the quiet guidance of a man who taught through action, not words. And James? He continued his work exactly as before. Early mornings, late evenings, sweeping, repairing, always with the same quiet presence. But there was one difference. The stone bench was no longer just a place to leave food. It had become a gathering spot for children who needed company, a place of safety for those carrying invisible battles. When asked by a visiting consultant about his intervention strategy, James simply shrugged. I just figure everybody's fighting a battle we can't see. A sandwich and a moment of peace won't fix it, but it lets them know they're not fighting alone. And so in a small school in Arkansas, a janitor's kindness became a legacy, not through medals or speeches, but through meals shared, burdens lifted, and lives quietly changed. The Marines had saluted, the town had honored, but for James, the real reward was simpler, knowing no child would feel forgotten under his watch. Sometimes the truest heroes are not the ones remembered in history books, but the ones who choose compassion when no one else is looking. If this story touched you, share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. Follow, like, and leave a comment, because every act of compassion deserves to echo beyond the moment it is given.